My missing husband came home, but I just know it isn't him. My husband went missing 6 months ago. Just went out to work one day and never came home. It was a horrible shock to the whole neighborhood because things like that just didn't happen in our little slice of white picket fence suburbia. The police launched an investigation and the neighborhood watch sent out search parties, but no one ever found any evidence to indicate what had happened to him. Our families were devastated. Recently, the missing posters have been taken down or papered over. The updates from the police became less frequent and dwindled away. I accepted that, hard as it was to admit, my Rick wasn't coming back. Until he did. A week ago, I was in the back garden watering my petunias when I heard the garden gate creak open. I jerked my head in that direction and there he was, exactly the same as he was the day he disappeared. Same windswept blonde hair and bright blue eyes, same curl to his pink lips. I was in shock. Our families had mourned for him, and yet there he was, standing in our garden like he had just popped out for milk or something. When I asked where he had been, he said he didn't know. He couldn't remember anything about the last 6 months. All our family and friends are beside themselves with joy. They almost can't believe it. But that's just thing. I don't believe it. Look, I understand how crazy this all sounds. I do. Our families would never believe me. And I can't go to the police unless I want to end up in a straitjacket. But I just know that the man sleeping next to me isn't my husband. I don't know what to do. I know I should be happy, but I'm not. I'm terrified. I don't know much about anything supernatural or paranormal. I don't even like watching horror movies. But something about this whole situation makes my skin crawl. Just let me explain why I'm so sure. Once I've done that, hopefully one of you will believe me and you'll be able to tell me what to do. The morning after Rick came home, I made him a cup of tea. When I handed it to him, he gave me the brightest smile. Then he took a sugar cube from the dish on the table and dropped it into the cup. Our house was in chaos with his return, and I was still in shock, so I didn't think much of it at the time, but it's been replaying in my mind ever since. I know it doesn't sound very significant, but my husband never put sugar in his tea. He was always adamant that it ruined the taste, and he'd get so frustrated if I ever put sugar in his cup by accident. And yet, this man had sugar. Then it was the golf. A few days ago, when he was out visiting his mom, I recorded a golf tournament that was showing on the TV. It was one of Rick's favorite golfers that was competing, and he never missed it. Once, he even skipped out on an anniversary dinner just to watch a championship. Only, when he came home from his parents and I told him what I'd done, he just seemed unbothered. Like, he said thanks and everything, and then he asked if I wanted to get dinner. He didn't even watch it, and that's just so out of character for him. Then one night I woke up around 2 a.m. to see Rick's face inches from mine, just looking at me with these blank eyes. I kind of gave this nervous laugh and asked, "Baby, what are you doing?" And he didn't answer. For like a solid 30 seconds. He just stared, almost like he was looking right through me. Then he suddenly smiled and said, "Sorry, honey. Sometimes I just can't believe this is real." Then he just rolled over and went to sleep. I didn't get much sleep after that, myself. Yesterday, about a week after he came home, the neighborhood threw a street party to celebrate his return. Everyone from our street and the streets on either side turned up to see him and tell him how happy they are that he's all right. When he wasn't standing with his arm around my waist, he was milling around chatting amicably to each and every one of our neighbors, even the little kids. Jackson, our next-door neighbor Sally's toddler, wanted to play peekaboo, and Rick happily played along with a smile on his face. Now, my husband never did that. Rick always said he didn't like kids. That's why we never had any. And so he never wanted to play with any of the neighborhood children, especially not Jackson. Rick all but avoided him. Before he disappeared, I had started to suspect it was so I wouldn't see them together and notice the subtle but unmistakable similarities. The final nail in the coffin, proverbially speaking, was Sally. Just this morning, she came knocking on our door. Her excuse was the tray of brownies she carried, but I think she just wanted to push her way into our morning so that she could see for herself what the situation was. After she left, I called her a nosy busybody. Rick laughed, kissed my head, and agreed with me. That was when I knew for sure that it couldn't really be him. Rick always used to get so mad whenever I insulted Sally, like I didn't have any right to hate her even though she'd been fucking my husband for years. But today there was none of that. He didn't even try to defend her. I know what you must be thinking. If he was in an accident or something, he might have had some kind of traumatic brain injury that caused him to forget some things about his life, maybe even change his personality. And that's a valid, reasonable explanation. I have no doubt it's what the police would tell me if I reported all this. But you know why I'm dead certain that man isn't my husband? He doesn't have a scar. If he was really Rick, he'd have a scar on the side of his forehead, shaped like the golf club I hit him with. But there's nothing. Not a mark. Honestly, I'm this close to going out tonight and digging up my petunias just to make sure he's still under there. I don't know what I'm sharing a bed with, but I know it's not my husband. So what the hell am I going to do? My missing husband came home, but I know it isn't really him. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for your concern and support. Even though I'm not giving out my real name, I obviously took a huge risk by telling anyone this at all, and I'm so grateful you've all tried to be helpful. I'm so sorry for the delay in updating. I've had some things to figure out. So I'll start with what I know. 1. My husband is dead. In the end, I decided not to dig up the petunias. It was a rash, unadvisable notion, which I have since abandoned because I realized how much worse things could get if I was caught. I've been smart about the whole thing so far, and I'm not about to throw that all away. It's too big of a risk. I did, however, thoroughly examine the flowers and the earth around them for any sign of disturbance, but I found none. Of course, I found none. I don't know what I thought had happened, that my garden was some sort of pet cemetery and my husband had clawed his way back from the beyond. Even to me, of all people, that sounds crazy. No, my husband is dead. In my heart, I know that beyond any shadow of a doubt, which means that whoever is in my kitchen right now is a complete stranger. 2. He looks and sounds exactly like Rick. His own parents don't even notice the difference, for heaven's sake. But he doesn't act like him at all, which tells me again that he is a stranger, that he never knew me before this, and he certainly never knew Rick. He doesn't enjoy the things Rick enjoyed. He doesn't say the sort of things Rick said. He doesn't complain, doesn't raise his voice, doesn't lie or gaslight or cheat. Frankly, he's a better husband than Rick ever was. Honestly, when I think about it like that, I'm almost tempted just to let it go. I tried to let it go, not to get caught up in worrying and just accept my new life for what it is. But I find myself unable to let it go. Because, even though this man seems ordinary and kind and reasonable, there's one thing that scares me still. For someone to have so confidently taken Rick's place, they would somehow have to be sure themselves that the real Rick would not return to complicate their plans, however innocent or sinister those plans may be. Whoever this man is who is calling himself Rick, he must surely know that Rick is dead. And if he knows that, I would bet anything that he also knows how. I've gambled with my life and my freedom before, and I don't intend to do so again. A couple of you suggested that Rick might have had a twin that, for whatever reason, I never knew about, or perhaps a doppelganger who saw his chance at a more comfortable life and took it. Either of these seemed to me to be the closest to the realm of possibility, so they were the first theories I set out to confirm or disprove. A DNA test would surely be able to confirm whether this man is my husband's twin or someone completely unrelated. Of course, I was hardly going to tell him about it. At best, he would refuse, and at worst, well, I didn't want to find out. So about a week after my last post, I ordered 2 separate DNA tests designed for finding one's relatives and ancestors and had them delivered whilst Rick was at work. Then, a few nights later, I waited until he was asleep, actually asleep, not half asleep and staring, and I pulled out a few strands of his hair, not enough that it would be noticeable in the morning, but sufficient amount to send away in a little tube to be analyzed. Much to my relief, he didn't wake up. I'm not sure how I would have explained it if he had. I sent the hair away to the DNA test companies, and they told me I'd have to wait a couple of weeks for the results. And in those couple of weeks, things have gotten stranger, shall we say. You see, I've noticed that Rick never seems to eat of his own accord. Like, he'll make dinner for us both, but that seems more to do with when I mention that I'm hungry than with his own desire to eat. He doesn't snack between meals. He never goes for a glass of water. I don't even think he takes anything with him to work for lunch. There's something else too. Rick's beard trimmer is still in its box, exactly where he left it 6 months ago, covered in dust and quite obviously unused. And yet Rick has been home for nearly a month, and his beard doesn't seem to be any longer, even though he used to trim it twice a week. On top of that, the staring has become a frequent occurrence, and not just in the middle of the night. I catch him watching me during the day too, always looking away or laughing it off whenever I notice him doing it. Anyway, I might as well tell you why I'm writing this now, because I can't make head nor tail of the situation anymore. The DNA tests came back in the mail this afternoon, before Rick came home from work. I opened them quickly, eager to see who was included in the list of relatives, whether there were any names I recognized. Either way, it would answer my question. Only, I don't have an answer. All I have are more questions, because the first test came back as inconclusive, with a note from the company telling me I had to send them a viable hair sample in order for it to work. I didn't understand that. I'd cut the hair myself, after all. And what did they mean by viable? But it was the second test that concerned me the most. Where there should have been information about demographic and regional origin, there was nothing, only a line of printed black letters spelling out the word unknown. Where there should have been a list of relatives and ancestors, there was no one. Not just no one related to Rick. No, I mean no one. According to the DNA test, this man has no relatives, no family, no ancestors, no biological connections near or distant. That should be impossible, right? How can a person exist without any kind of relation? And how can he come from nowhere? I'm typing this up on the computer in the study, with several tabs open on various Google searches as I try to figure out how this could be possible. The DNA test lies on the table behind me, taunting me with the evidence of everything I do not know. And then I hear it, clear as day, coming from the doorway behind me. Rebecca? If I didn't know better, I'd say my heart stopped. I would know that voice anywhere. I never heard him come in, never even heard the door open. Dimly, in the back of my mind, I recall that our door creaks every time it opens. How could I not have heard it? I turn over my shoulder towards not Rick, a false bright smile on my face. He is not smiling. His face is calm, but there's something hard about the line of his mouth that sets me on edge. What the hell is this? His voice is perfectly level, but something about it makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There's an undertone to his voice that I haven't noticed before now, something low and subtly grating. Even the real Rick never sounded like that. He holds something up, one eyebrow arched. When I see what he's holding, my stomach plummets. The results of the DNA test. I once asked a famous ghost hunter what his scariest moment was. This is his story. Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline. But the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that. and a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt?" "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded nervous, because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter? I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. "I know I did." "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh. It was forced, I know it was. There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work. This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary. At least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry." I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the Intro to University classes, then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old, I was young. I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career. "I know," I remember saying. He nodded as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the Intro to University classes. Then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old. I was young. I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career. "I know," I remember saying. He nodded, as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually, They were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just floating isn't even the right word. Just coming down the stairs straight at me. It had no eyes. It had no face, and yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted. It was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together. Not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said, he built his own home office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom. Mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know what he did to them. And it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest places, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind little by little. Until last week, when I moved in with my fiancée, when I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold, because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room, and I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know.